Well, welcome everybody. It's great to be here. I always kind of enjoy doing these virtual Zoom conferences. It's kind of the new thing for all of us. I guess it's not so new now. It's been a couple of years that we've been doing this, it seems like, I guess. Um, but I'm glad to be here and to help everybody through a self-editing class. I guess I'll talk about how I started kind of giving these workshops. And, as I've been an agent for a number of years, and also a freelance editor, so I do side freelance editing, I began to notice that there were certain things about manuscripts that I'd be giving the same advice over and over again. And so I kind of started to take a list of the things I was telling, different writers and authors. And so that's kind of where my book came in, the author's checklist. That's kind of, I was probably taking notes for a couple of years, and eventually I had a kind of a slow period, and I thought, well, maybe I should work on this book, putting together ideas. And really it's a compilation of every piece of advice I think I've ever given to every author. I have probably hundreds of editorial letters in my files and in my books. And so I would just basically write down, all the advice that I've, given to people, and look through those letters actually to see if there was anything I was missing. But a lot of times, what I've found is that with a little bit of instruction, these are things that can be kind of, taken care of, or easily, modified and changed so that it doesn't hamper your success in getting an agent, or getting your work to the best possible version that you can. Because some people don't have the goal of getting an agent. Some people want, just to have their, best work. And so that's kind of how the book, came to be, basically. And one of the things that is difficult, I think, for writers is it's very hard for writers to get feedback on their manuscripts, because agents, we work on commission, so we don't have a lot of time. The more time that we're devoting to giving advice and feedback takes away from time of like finding a project and shopping it and trying to sell it. And oftentimes our commission comes in spread out throughout the year, like it would for you if you were to sell a project. You don't get that advance all up front, you get it in pieces. And so a lot of times agents really just don't have time to give authors the feedback that they need, to just even basic feedback, little things. Some people, they just don't offer that. And I've always, because I've kind of come from the writer's side, I've always wanted to also be a writer. I really felt when I got into the industry that people weren't getting the feedback they needed, and I wanted to try to bridge that gap. And so really my creating the book was my way of basically feeling like most of the projects that come into me are about 4 drafts away from even being ready. That's generally probably what I've seen over the course of my decade plus experience in the industry. So 4 drafts away. So I thought, well, if I put this book together, that would get authors about 2 drafts closer. Usually an agent comes in and does a draft with you. So really it's just kind of trying to get yourself to that point of where an agent can take the project and they can do one pass with you, and then you're ready to, ideally to, shop your project. And the other thing is that, I've been around for a long time, so I'm looking for projects that come in that are ready to turn around with one edit, just simple things that can be addressed that then I can take the project out. And sometimes you'll find agents that have been in the industry for less time that are willing to do more rounds of editorial work. So sometimes you can kind of be in a situation like that where you're getting, the feedback, or you're getting somebody that can work with you over a longer period of time, like in draft wise. But the idea with the book is really just to get people as close as possible, so that then you're so close to, being, ready that an agent, will take on your work. And then or ideally, like I said, your work is in the best possible position, in terms of indie publishing or hybrid publishing, whatever you kind of choose to do. So that's kind of where the book came from, and that's sort of helping me to kind of create these self-editing workshops for writers. I do feel like it's advantageous for people to get a developmental editor to look at your work before you submit, but it's not, it is expensive, so it's not always possible for everybody to do that. So the book is kind of, the next best thing, hopefully, to get you closer. But I thought tonight I would talk about like the 10 things to look at, the 10 top things that would probably garner a rejection outside of submission materials not being ready or not being quite right, or outside of just some general, a lot of times you get rejections for projects that have nothing to do actually with the writing itself. There are a number of reasons that people get rejected, from sending your project to the wrong agent, not the right fit, to that agent just being in a health crisis, or we all went through 2020 and then 2021, and it's just sometimes bad timing. But for those projects that make it through, where it isn't bad timing, but it does have to do with the writing, we can go through like a list of the top 10 things that sort of come to mind. And there's a lot of information, so I'm just going to ramble it off. And since it's such a small group, if there's anybody here who has specific questions or feedback that they've been given on anything that we've talked about, like I can try and troubleshoot with you a little bit to see, that's the beauty of small workshops or small classes, is that we can kind of troubleshoot if you're having some kind of issue with, one of your characters or something like that. So I think the most difficult thing about self-editing is that, one, it's hard to get the feedback for the reasons that I kind of mentioned, but also it's really hard to kind of be objective about your own work. And I'm in grad school right now, and so and for writing also, and it's really true that when you put your work away for a little bit, you come back to it, you're like, why did I do that? Or I could say that so much better, or, so it's really a strange thing that it's hard to be objective about our own work. And I think one of the things that might make it a little bit easier, and one of the ideas that I had for the book also was the approaching your work from the perspective of like individual pieces. So, taking the time to look at your dialogue, on its own, taking the time to look at the length of your chapters, throughout your book. Are they uniform in length? So doing certain things that where you're looking objectively at individual pieces of your manuscript to see if anything kind of stands out. And so another example I would get, good for uniformity is one thing that we come across in manuscripts that will garner rejection. And of course, there's a reason for it, but looking for uniformity, looking for, like looking at your chapter length, like I said, to see, are they mostly falling around the same number of pages? Are there going to be, 3 or 4 chapters that are like, really short, that aren't adding anything to the project, that you're feeling like you need to get in for some reason? So I see that a lot with really, really short chapters that don't really add anything. Or what was the other thing that I was going to say? Another thing is people who have alternating points of view in their manuscript, where you have maybe 2 or 3 different characters, and you start with one, and then 6 chapters later another one pops up, and then and so the tricky thing with alternating point of view characters is that usually you have to kind of set up the dynamic right from the beginning, so your reader actually knows how to read your book. They need to know that it's going to be that type of an alternating character point of view chapter thing happening, right? And so those are things you want to set up quite early, so that they know that that's what's going to happen, even if you kind of deviate from the way in which they occur sort of later. And sometimes what will happen with those types of situations also is that you have to look at every single point of view character as though you're developing it from a first chapter perspective. So every one of those three characters is, given, is treated like they're being developed as though they're a first chapter. So they also have things at stake. They also are dreaming of certain things. They also have an inciting incident in their chapter that gets their story moving forward and things like that. And sometimes what we see with that also is that what I'll have a number of authors do is count up, these alternating point of view characters and see, well, how many of Maria do I have and how many of Robert do I have, because sometimes the chapters are coming in a way that doesn't feel very uniform, that feels a little out of sync. And so it's good to, almost count up the number that you have for each character to kind of figure out sometimes who's your main character. Are these other ones also main characters? Are they secondary characters? And how much real estate should we give them? How much do they deserve in terms of their storyline? And so sometimes I'll have people cut out those characters or have them covered through the other points of view and that sort of thing. So those are some things that can, happen with uniformity. But back to kind of more specific things. Usually when we open up a manuscript, right away from the first, most agents can probably tell within the first 10 pages, probably fewer pages if they're going to take on a project. And again, sometimes that has to do with personal interest, like it's too dark for me. It might not be the right fit for me, but it might be perfect for my boss, that sort of thing. Or sometimes it really is the writing, like the prose itself isn't polished enough, things like that. And so you're really trying to kind of attack all those things in your editorial process, before submitting. And of course, great writing is a combination of so many different things. It's good dialogue, it's the prose itself, it's characterization, it's setting building, and a number of different things. And so and that's how we start to look at your project. So when you submit it to us, right from the start, we're looking at, like, within the first two paragraphs, who's the main character? Am I feeling compelled by this main character? And where am I in place and time? Usually that place and time and setting is set up really, really pretty quickly. There are some pet peeves, that agents have, like dreams, like waking up from a dream or waking up in bed. Like that's kind of a pet peeve of agents. I don't usually, I guess it's been done so much that they're looking for people that aren't doing that. Also weather. I'm kind of like a weather or setting based person. So I don't really so much mind the whole weather thing, but I think if you start with weather, but we don't necessarily know where we are in place and time, that could be a problem. So those are some basic things you want to look out for as you're starting your manuscript. And so right from those first couple paragraphs, like I said, we're looking, I'm looking at the character. Who is this character? What do I know about them in this short, in this first page? Where are they in place and time? Place and time and setting is really important. Not everybody takes advantage of setting, I really appreciate a well set manuscript, because sometimes the setting can act like a character, especially if it's like, a cold Vermont winter setting and a mystery, that sort of thing. So those setting, can be really great. I also feel like I'm working on a freelance project right now of a project that's set in New York in the 60s, and it's based off a true story. And there are so many opportunities for the author to really show us New York at that time period in ways that, that we haven't seen before. And that would be another thing, is a lot of times we set projects in places where a lot of us have been, or we've seen a lot of TV, like, Paris, San Francisco, those types of places. So if you're going to be setting your projects in really well-known places, you want to really bring them alive in ways that maybe, people haven't heard about before, really see if you can bring out things in that setting that are unusual, so that we're not, so that you're not giving us setting information that's really common to all of us. So you're always looking in your manuscript to not take the shortcut, right? To go deeper into the setting, to bring us things that we possibly haven't seen. There's one thing that I love in manuscripts, is to learn things. If you can impart, or give us like 5 things throughout the manuscript that we wouldn't know otherwise, if somehow that can make its way into the narrative, that's really a great. And I would say the same thing about themes. Oftentimes authors, all of us are working with themes, whether we know it or not. And usually when I read a manuscript, I can tell the themes that the author is working with, even if they aren't totally consciously working with those themes. And just like all of us are doing that in our own lives, like we all experience themes in our own life that are things we're all going to experience, but we may have a really very different understanding of those themes when we start our life, or or early into our life, and toward the end. So what, one thing that I'm always asking authors to do is spend more time looking at the themes that they're working with across the manuscript, and try to incorporate them into your chapters, into each chapter, if not one theme per chapter. It doesn't have to, you don't have to, like bog it down or anything, but if you can, kind of work with themes across your manuscript, it's going to help to give your manuscript much more dimension. And that's something that I see lacking a lot, is there's not very much dimension. It doesn't, like I said, you don't have to hit us over the head with it, but it is, working with themes, it does help to kind of layer the manuscript more consciously. And also it gives, oftentimes your characters are a reflection of those themes, the embodiment of those themes. And so if you have characters that are working and struggling with one particular theme in their worlds, obviously that's going to make them make certain decisions based on those themes. And it can help you to create plot movement too, if you're a little light on plot. So once you kind of know your characters well, and you know what they're struggling with across their characterization, you can use what they're struggling with to help you to create moments in the plot that will, may work on behalf of your main character or against your main character. So themes, I always find that that's advice I give to everybody across the board. And usually I suggest people kind of work on the thematic, to kind of write down the top 4 themes they think that they're working with on paper, so that you can see it separate from your manuscript, and just always have it in mind. And the other thing is, what do you most want to say with your project? I think if you really understand what that is, what your main, concept or idea is, that will also help to kind of just knowing these things kind of helps to keep you on track in terms of what you're doing, and or to add dimension. Sometimes you've got everything written, and it's a pretty well structured, and the story's in place, but sometimes you just need a little more dimension to the characters, and to give them more of an internal life, and the thematic understanding, the themes that they are working with and that you're working with, can help you to do that. So back to kind of what we look for when we're reading manuscripts, or when we first open them up. The other thing, another thing that kind of takes manuscripts down is pacing. So oftentimes what I might find is that an author, there is no inciting incident in the first chapter. And sometimes what I'll find is that I'll have to go as far as the 3rd or 4th chapter to look for the true start. And there's a number of reasons that authors do this. I think sometimes they're trying to show the routine of the character, or they're trying to show that they're a good person. So they have some idea in mind of why it's not starting where it should start. But what'll happen is sometimes, you'll get about 4 4 chapters in, and then there's the inciting incident, the one that really should be kind of pulled up to the front. And so ideally you'll want to be flexible enough as an author that if you sometimes I know that I work with people and they get really, well, if I do that, then I can't have this. And I'm like, well, the goal is to know from a storytelling perspective that you really need to kind of get things moving right in chapter 1, but you might have to lose something or reimagine something, start those characters. Usually it's like starting the characters a little further into the story so that there's not so much lead in. And sometimes we see this with chapters too, is there's a lot of lead into the beginning of a chapter, whereas my screenwriting teacher likes to talk, well, he said this about dialogue, but he's like show up late and leave early, basically, so you want to kind of start, avoid all the pleasantries and the lead in, and really try to start at the heart of what needs to be, communicated, or the heart of the issue. And so for, manuscripts, obviously it's nice that you want to kind of take the time to show the world of the characters, and probably actually in science fiction writing and fantasy, there's a lot more build up and lead in than, a mystery or a thriller or a romance, that type of thing. So this isn't, all of this advice doesn't work for every single manuscript. I'll just put it that way, that it's just something that you want to keep in mind, that you don't want to, put off these inciting incidents or these things that get the story moving for too long, unless you are maybe working with science fiction and fantasy, where it's gonna take a little bit longer because you have a lot of world building to do, that type of thing. So pacing is, one thing that we look at right from the start. And, I'll say that I and my agency, like we might kind of jump around. We might, jump to the second chapter or the third chapter if the first one isn't working, just to see. I know that my colleague has had a lot of success with one author whose project I think really started about 4 chapters in, and she was a newer agent at the time, and she took the time to work with him, and he's gone on to be one of the best selling authors of our agency. So, but not every agent will, if you're looking for an agent, will do that. Not everybody will jump ahead and look to see if the start is just off and if it's an easy fix, unfortunately. Because sometimes when you're submitting, you only get 10 pages to submit, right? So, so that's something that you want to look at, and just try to, see if you can just be flexible about, alter, to get that inciting incident up toward the front. Can you reimagine, even if you have to reimagine your characters from a different age, can you reimagine it so that for storytelling purposes, it works, so pacing is important. The prose itself, like that's obviously important. A lot of times we see prose that's really, it kind of works. It's uniform. It's got its utilitarian or whatever it has. It has its function. Sometimes I will see projects where it's not the sharpest, but it sort of serves its purpose. It's more plot based, and so the writing is kind of, it isn't bad, but it's also can also not be sparking. And so I have a chapter in the book on prose where you can kind of go through and, eliminate, it brings up all the top things to look at with respect to prose. It's the prose itself, which is, removal of adverbs, as many as you can, punctuation issues to get those, usually around M dashes and things like that, some rules around M dashes. Filter words are another thing that comes up. And, my client TJ, all of us, we all have words that we tend to, gravitate toward and we overuse. And so he's created a full list of those words for himself. And so as he gets toward the end of his edits, he goes through his list of words and searches them. You can also do things like, I'm not sure how great of an idea it is to kind of put all your work out on the web, but there's something called wordle.net that will tell you your most used words. And so things like that, And there are lists in that particular section, and probably easily, through Google, where you can find lists of words that you can, remove. Because also, as you approach your work, like say, for example, with adverbs, adverbs are kind of seen as cheating in the industry, and though bestsellers are full of them, you kind of want to operate as, when you become a bestseller, you can kind of do what you want as well. Oftentimes those books aren't edited anymore like they used to be. And so but usually when you're forced to look at some things in your prose, it will only help you strengthen your sentences, and your sentence structure. So it's worth kind of going back through there and line editing and seeing, is there a way that I can, instead of using an adverb attached to dialogue, is there a way that I can show this character, how this character feels through their actions, or their description, some kind of description. And so adverbs are things like that. So the prose itself, you'll want to just check. Sometimes I see problems with sentence structure. I might see an author who's better at, or not very good at complex sentence structure. And so I'll suggest they simplify they move more towards simple sentence structure in their projects. But a combination of both can be nice. And so looking at things from that perspective, I think is important. And also I always kind of suggest people to read poetry, because poetry, it's probably, like I just went through a grad school poetry class, and it really forces you not to pick the low-hanging fruit. There are so many different ways to say, so many different words to say the same thing. And I think those projects that have word choice that stands out, it stands out. So, always kind of I would just always kind of be in a position where I would read poetry so that it can help you to, get across in subtle ways and in beautiful ways the things that you're trying to say. And poetry is kind of really the best example of being able to be economic with words, but get things across in a really unique and unusual way. So that would be my suggestion for helping to move away from prose that doesn't quite spark. And okay, so dialogue is another thing that you can look at independently in your manuscript. And sometimes the reason that I suggest people be looking at individual or independent aspects of their manuscript is that there's something, is when you go in to kind of work on your project, what happens is you start tinkering, and then you get pulled in, and then you forget what you're doing, and you're editing this whole first chapter when really you were kind of going in just to look at dialogue. And I think that if you can kind of approach your work from a slightly more objective place and look at the individual pieces like that, like take one day to count up your chapter lengths, to see, are they uniform? Take one day to look at all the themes that you have, that you address in each chapter, like how many, are you addressing anything on an internal level in each chapter? So to the extent that you can do that, it kind of will create, overall will create, a project that's really been looked at in a really deep way. Whereas like if you go in and you're just kind of tinkering and then you start working on all sorts of different things in one chapter, you kind of lose that, that objectivity, and then you forget what you're doing, and then you burn out and things like that, so so that would be my suggestion. So dialogue is another one. Oftentimes people focus a lot on pleasantries. So the hi, how are you? Do you want a cup of coffee? Would you like a donut? These things that show that the characters are very nice characters. Or you might be like one author that I worked with freelance, was kind of, I think she was trying to show like Southern gentility, that sort of thing. Whereas it doesn't, if all of your chapters are like that, then you may want to go back in and start those chapters from a different point, because you don't want a lot of chapters that are beginning at the hello, how are you, type of situation. So it's better if you can start those characters a little bit further in, even if it's just to break up the dynamic of how your chapters are starting. You don't want everything to be kind of uniform in how they open and close. like the character shows up and then the character leaves kind of at the end of the chapter. So just see if you can find a way to kind of move away from the pleasantries with dialogue. Again, with dialogue also, you're going to want to, remove the adverbs, try and see if you can make sure that your dialogue is really individual to the character, and also telling us something about the character, giving us information about the character. I don't often see dialogue that's really sharp. It doesn't come across, like, sometimes it works for the project, but it doesn't give me that witty kind of repartee between the characters. So, keep that in mind as you're kind of working on your dialogue, and see whether the dialogue that you do have is, telling us something about the character, or showing their wit or their humor or their relationship with the other character. And also to kind of keep in mind that, oftentimes with dialogue, we don't say what we mean. Oftentimes when people, we're holding back, we're not showing our face because we don't want them to know how we feel, or we're saying yes, but we really mean no, so think about dialogue, and take some time actually in your own life, if you're around people or in a setting where you can overhear dialogue, just focus on listening without even looking at the people that you're around, and see what you can tell about a person just from listening to them. And the ways in which they speak, because oftentimes people are not, hi, how are you? Would you like a cup of coffee? If you're in a cafe or something like that. But, oftentimes we kind of jump in on each other, and we jump in from totally different perspectives and things like that. So, and in all these kind of subject areas, take the time to actually do research. And you can read, you can read about dialogue, but also there are a lot of articles online that talk about writing good dialogue. And so I think for all of these, subject matters, the more research you do on any of them, the better. And, I know when I worked on my book, I did tons of research for each of the different sections, and I would just nerd out, because we're all writers here, right? So you just kind of start nerding out a little bit on some of these crazy things that you find. Like I did a lot of study on prologues, and and their ancient use, or how we used to use them. And so yeah, you'll just find a lot of interesting things by doing some research. So that's what I have to say on dialogue. Characterization, of course, is another thing that will, obviously can take down a manuscript pretty easily. I mean, right from the beginning, as we look at your manuscript, we want to know if we're pulled in by your character or not. Usually that's what we call the unsympathetic character, where maybe we're not pulled in by your character right from the beginning. Sometimes there can be reasons for this. I worked on one project that I've mentioned before, where the main character killed butterflies for a living. And it was sort of like, because they were a scientist, and I was just like, that is just never going to work. It's too, yeah, it just makes them too unsympathetic right from the start. And then I have another book I'm working on right now where the main character for this project is just so unsympathetic. Like he's just, his perspective on things is so kind of, I don't know, dour, or kind of, he's not dark, but I don't know, he just seems like he's a hustler or something. And luckily she has another female character that comes in and alternates. And so it gives you enough, like the first chapter is good enough to make you read the second chapter, but you don't really like the guy. And then you get a character that you kind of like a little bit more. And so it's always a fine dance between what's too unsympathetic, and you want to, be careful that your character is not too unsympathetic. And sometimes that's just a very easy fix. That's something that can be a line edit. I remember having a project where one of the characters is just a little too down on her luck. It was kind of the character that was clumsy, and she was a commercial fiction project, and clumsy and sort of, not the popular girl, that kind of thing. And she just, I guess she read like she was just not, I don't know. And of course she changes over the manuscript, but somehow, like just in that first chapter, she just read unsympathetic just because, you know, of these few things. And so sometimes it's just a matter of editing out lines that, you know, because oftentimes what it is that, you know, the lines, the description lines or the things that the character have been through build up within that first chapter. And then it's, you have to just, you know, kind of chip away at those. And then suddenly your character isn't reading unsympathetic anymore. So I've worked on a couple projects where sometimes it's just a line edit of the first chapter, and then the character suddenly is completely sympathetic. So, but you also want your characters to have depth. You know, you want to know as much about all of your characters as you possibly can. Sometimes I'll run across characters that I know would not make certain choices in a manuscript that the author is having them make. And so I'm like, I just don't think this character would do this, you know? And so you want to really, even if they're secondary characters or not very important, you want to know as much about them as you can so that ultimately you can use them to the benefit of your storytelling. And oftentimes I'll have, you know, I'll work on a manuscript that has kind of a character that ends up being the killer in the manuscript, but it's not very surprising. So then we'll go back and we'll look at all the different characters. Well, what if this person did it? And then you'll know right away why it will or will not work. And then you'll hit upon one and you'll be like, yes, like this character would not be suspected, excuse me, my language. You know, I wouldn't suspect them, and they would you'd maybe have a reason to do it as well. But, you know, so sometimes what you want to do is kind of think of your characters like chess pieces. Like, what if I move this character into this position? What would all the other, you know, characters on the board do? Like, and so that will sometimes help you to kind of figure out, you know, how to use them to better serve your story, basically. And you'll want to make sure that your characters have, you know, your main character has some backstory. Ideally, if they have, and backstory is different from background. So your background of your character is more like their religion, their, you know, schooling, where they've come from, what skills they have, those types of things that you set up early so that later we're not surprised in the manuscript. But backstory sometimes works it works sort of with your inciting incident, because say if your character has had, you know, a situation that triggers them that then occurs in some way in that inciting incident, even though they may or may not be related, it sends the character on kind of like a dual quest, right? Where they have to go forward in the main storyline, but they're also always having to look back at this thing that happened to them and heal from it and things like that. So backstories can be a really nice way to give more dimension to your manuscript. If your characters don't have anything like that, sometimes it gets a little, you know, it gets a little one-dimensional feeling, or flat, you know, when we're reading the story. So you're kind of looking for, you know, and again, you're looking at those characters to see what themes they embody, so that, you know, can my characters, you know, make decisions based off of this, you know, like if they're people that are looking for love, but they've been abandoned, but so they're always defensive when they meet somebody, you know, it's like, so they're always getting in their own way or whatever it is, you know. So you want to kind of try and think out the psychology of your characters a little bit like that, and see if that can help or hinder kind of the main storyline. So let's see, we don't have a ton of time, but plot is another, you know, obviously is another one. I'm working on a project, or just finished a project that didn't have a lot of plot. It was more an exploration of the characters and their how they would deal with grief. And so sometimes you know, you're going to need something that strings your story along, right? And so oftentimes if the writing is elevated, if it's a little bit a cut above the prose itself, and it's more about character development, characterization, those projects lean a little bit more literary, so they can get away with a lighter plot, but you can't get away with no plot. And so usually you're looking for, you know, the rising action. Basically, you're looking for rising action in your story to make sure that, this is what happens if you don't have enough plot. The climax is never really, it doesn't go very, like there is no, it's hard to tell the difference between the climax and the resolution. You just kind of, it never peaks. so to speak. So you want to be looking for that, the plot development. I think my client Mia, who's working on a book that can apply screenwriting techniques to novel writing, and she says you need like usually at least 6 instances of rising action before the climax. And so so we're looking for that. And then plot, subplots are always great. Like, again, if you have that character that also is dealing with something else from their past, that usually can act like a subplot. Or I had a project that I worked with before where I think he had just 2 dual investigations happening. So there was a federal investigation. It was like a murder or a thriller. It was a federal investigation, but also a state one. So that was kind of interesting, and he had a lot of characters that he was working with. So he's a really interesting writer on that level. Yeah, so that's something you want to look for in plot. World building, we kind of talked about that. Setting, we want to know where your project is set. Try and take more advantage of setting, because sometimes people just forget it, like it's not that important, but it really adds a lot if you have some kind of richness about your setting. World building is also important, especially for science fiction and fantasy. It's crucial. But you also want to make sure that even if you're not writing science fiction or fantasy, that your project, the world building is set up, even on that level of your character and their background. Because if we get, halfway through the manuscript and then suddenly your character has, is able to kind of pull out some martial arts moves and, and delay a character, or subdue a character, but we never even knew that they had that skill from the start, it doesn't work. So you want to be careful of telling us after the fact that your character has this ability. So another project that I'm working on, or that I had worked on, was the character had crossed over and was telling the story sort of like the Lovely Bones. So it was telling the story from this other world, but the rules for that world were not set up well, so that pretty much throughout the manuscript she would have to tell us why this character could do something, or that this character could do something. So I had to spend a lot of time kind of thinking about the afterlife for her and figuring out a way to really simplify it so that people wouldn't even wonder. It was like there's 1 or 2 rules, and then and so that it wouldn't be something that was doubted. And so that's a really important case of kind of world building, where you have to set up all those rules right from the start, so that you're not spending the rest of your manuscript trying to explain why the character could do what they did. So so we'll move on to, so world building is important. Just kind of think about that. Is there anything else? Is there anything politically about the climate, or religious, or the state, the city? Think about from the macro setting perspective, is there anything else that needs to be there so that we can understand your story better, or that will help to, develop the story. And then genre rules are really important if you're writing mysteries or thrillers or romance. Like, there's a set of rules that you really don't want to deviate from. Usually mystery, there you have to have the dead body in the first chapter, that kind of thing. Also, they usually tend to have word count requirements, so you don't want to fall too far outside of those. And so often I worked in newspaper, and oftentimes we were given word count, so you have to write your story based on the most important things there, within that word count. And so you kind of have to whittle down and decide what that is. So if your word count is huge, you kind of have to think like that also, in terms of, what do I have to remove? What do I absolutely have to have? And what can I remove, and not impact the story too much? And sometimes that's a simple line edit, going through the prose and weeding out, things that bog it down, or the dialogue, things like that. And then sometimes it's just a line edit, looking for words that aren't absolutely necessary. But, genre wise, you want to make sure you're hitting your word count. You want to make sure that you're writing, that you understand the rules. I know with romance, there are rules in terms of the love story. Usually they don't need to always have a happy ending, but they need to have a satisfying ending, that sort of thing. So you want to make sure that you're not kind of, that you don't get rejected out of hand because of basic guidelines like word count and stuff like that. Because there are a lot of agents that will reject you for word count, because they can tell, like, if you're coming in, say for a thriller or maybe a mystery at 100,000 words, we kind of know already it needs editing pretty much, so and again, these are guidelines. There are people that are exceptions to the rules, obviously, but usually, there's a reason that the rules are there. So and I'll just say, so that we have a little bit of time for questions. Timeline, sometimes people have really large, long timelines and they feel like they need to fill in all the gaps of time, or they use a lot of timekeeping language, like next Friday, or, a few hours later. It'd be great if you just remove as much of your timekeeping language as possible, start your character, because the reader can make jumps in time with, like really obvious ones, or if from the beginning you've set up your manuscript so that we know you're not following like time on a day-by-day basis, it really helps. So some manuscripts will start and you're kind of following that character right on their heels, and then there's a huge jump in time and it doesn't work because you've set it up so that we're following them pretty much on a day-to-day basis, if not hour by hour. And so you want to kind of look at your timeline, and if you are spanning, a really long period of time, you may want to set it up, the beginning of your story, so that we get used to these jumps in time, and that make sure that you're developing your characters in the story in a way in which those time jumps don't bother us. And so that's something that we see a lot, is timeline. And obviously, if you're spanning a really long period of time, it's almost better to focus on your project on pivotal events instead, so that you're not having to fill in, all those gaps of time. And that's where the show versus tell comes in, because a lot of times authors will, especially with memoir writing, and memoir follows the tenets of fiction. So this would have been a good class for memoir writers too, but oftentimes they'll kind of try to show childhood things and then they'll skip in time, but then kind of try and summarize all the stuff that happened, when you don't really need to do that. It's better if you kind of just go from event to event, and we'll jump with you. So you kind of want to set that up. We talked about point of view stuff and alternative point of views, and then uniformity is the same thing. Check your number of chapters, like your length. Usually for fiction, I like to commercial type fiction. Usually I like to see 15 double spaced manuscript pages, at least for the first, 40 pages or something. Some people, work in these small chapters. If you're working more upmarket or literary, you could go as long as 20 or 25, but usually I like to see at least 15 double spaced pages for a commercial fiction project, because that usually feels like you've covered everything. You've covered the setting, the characterization, the plot, inciting incident, everything's kind of in there, and the characters, because you're bringing in all your other characters usually from the beginning. So basically that's kind of like the, I guess, 40-minute version of, or is it longer? 50-minute version of self-editing. I don't know if any of you have any questions. I'd love to answer questions, and I can even stay a little longer to answer questions if you like.